So here's the deal. There's a hyper-concentration of wealth in America, and it's been getting worse since 1979. Oftentimes we call this period of growing inequality the Great Divergence, and we usually look at it in terms of income. But the gap is even bigger and more significant if we look at it in terms of wealth. Here are 10 people. Here are 10 $10 bills. Each person represents 10% of the American population. Each bill represents 10% of private wealth in the United States. If each person had $10, that would mean wealth was shared completely equally. It's not, and it never has been. In fact, there's been a huge gap between the wealthiest 10% of the population and everyone else, particularly since the Great Divergence started. In 1976, just before the Great Divergence started, the nation's wealthiest 10% owned 50% of the nation's wealth. A lot has changed since then. Let's look at 2007. By this time, the top 10% owned over 70% of the nation's wealth. So the bottom 90 had 30%. And wealth distribution was even more unequal closer to the top. Take this guy. He'll represent the top 1%, the wealthiest percent of Americans. And guess how much the top 1% owned? 34.6%. That's right, 1% of the population owned more than 90% of us, combined. Even worse, certain minority communities are disproportionately affected. For example, for every dollar of wealth owned by the average white family, the average family of color only has 7 cents. This inequality has serious consequences for minority families. In fact, the gap between white and black families is worth $95,000. In some states, that would be enough to pay for 4 years of a public university's tuition, for 2 kids, and tuition for public medical school. You see, reducing the wealth gap would have real and significant improvements on families' lives, such as increasing access to education for students of color. How are things now? Well, 2009 is the most recent year we have data for. We know that the top 10% are up to 75% of the nation's wealth. 90% of the country shares 25%. And again, more extreme, the wealthiest 1% owns 35.6% of all the private wealth in the United States. Quick review. 1976, the wealthiest 1% owned 22% of the nation's wealth. By 2007, they were up to 34.6%. And by 2009, they owned 35.6%. The top 10% have increased from 50% to 70% to 75% of the nation's wealth. That has left everyone else in the bottom 90, the vast majority of the American population, with less and less wealth year after year.